In this second Sunday of Ordinary Time, John places a spotlight on Jesus, whom we are called to follow. He reminds us that we need to recognize his voice. Samuel did not recognize it, or even the apostles at first. Being disciples is all about following the right voice. Samuel never had heard God's voice speak to him until that night. What are the ways that God calls our name? And do we recognize it and listen to what he is calling us to do? God often speaks in ways that we least expect, through our prayers, through others, and through circumstances. Listen for God's voice. To come, to see, and to stay with Jesus is a process. Andrew, as we heard today, tells his brother Peter that he had found the Messiah. Philip found Nathanael and told him, they, like us, need to point others to the way of Jesus. There are three different statements to think about in our readings tonight. In the first reading we hear, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." In the second reading, we have been purchased at a great price. And in the gospel, who are you looking for? In the first reading, we are reminded that we all need to recognize God's call. Samuel lived in the 11th century BC and did not recognize God's call until that night. Eli the priest told Samuel after the third time that he woke him up to listen to the Lord's voice and say, "Speak, Lord, your servant is listening." This is what we should also be saying. Being a disciple means to follow and listen to the voice of Christ. Do we follow God's voice or do we follow the world's voice? We need to listen to the Lord's voice in our hearts, just as the sheep knows the shepherd's voice and follows the shepherd. Oftentimes, people don't want to hear the Lord's voice speaking to them because they're afraid that what he may be saying to them. He might be asking them to go somewhere that they would rather not go. But the Lord does speak to us, even if we don't listen, because of all the noise that may be around us. He speaks to every heart and calls us to do the special work he planned for us to do in our lives. Many times, this is a call to a personal vocation, being married or single or religious life. How do we get to know the Lord's voice? One way would be to take time out each day for a quiet prayer, to listen for God's voice. Our prayer should not be all talking, but also be listening. In our second reading, Paul says that we are not our own. We belong to God and are bought by a price. Who we shall be looking for is the one who paid that price, which is Jesus. God made us for himself and has called us. The cost is not to follow the world, but to keep our eyes on Jesus and our heavenly home in heaven. We don't know what is ahead, a cross, a joy, a sorrow, or peace. St. Augustine said, "Convert me to your ways, O Lord, but not yet." The future can be frightening since we don't know what will be happening in this new year. Holiness is that call to conversion, a change of our habits, a change of our hearts, and following God wherever he may want to lead us. In the gospel, to be a disciple is all about following the right voice. We also hear about Simon's name being changed to Cephas, which means Peter. And later he was called the Rock. What does God call our name? Do we listen? Where maybe have we heard Jesus' voice calling us this week? God often speaks to us in the least unexpected way. To come and to stay with Jesus is a process that we begin at our baptism and continues on the rest of our lives. A call to embrace the mystery of life and to stay with Jesus and experience that mystery for ourselves. Others we know are also on the journey with us, that we aren't doing it alone. We just have to look around us tonight and see so many people that want to follow Jesus' voice in their lives. We come to the Eucharist each week to understand his call more fully in our lives by hearing the Word of God and partaking in the Eucharist to give us the strength that we need to do what he wants us to do this week. The call to Jesus is a personal relationship with him, and our fidelity is a call that we take for a lifetime. How do we listen to God's voice and do his will? Our whole life is a story of God's love that he has for us. God imitates the relationship and wants us to call to him what he has initiated for us. And he always reveals himself, calling us over and over again. Our call is to listen and be willing to do the will of God wherever he may lead us. Most times it's not to a third world country, but where we live. St. Paul reminds us in the second reading, we are not our own, we belong to God. As God called Samuel, and as Jesus called his disciples, so we also are being called. We receive communion so that we may be more like Jesus, and that we might ourselves be carrier of the good news to others, like John the Baptist was with his followers, and with Andrew and Peter tonight. This week, let us be more open to God to touch our hearts and to say as a psalm response, "Here am I, Lord, I come to do your will," and to do all that he asks us to do.